With the war in Ukraine still ongoing, it's not surprising that conventional warfare usually dominates the headlines. But underneath this traditional battlefield, there are other types of conflict that are taking place as well, that are a lot more quiet, but just as important. From covert influence operations, proxy militias, to economic pressure and cyber attacks, countries like Iran, Russia, and China have become extremely good at waging wars that don't look like wars in the traditional sense, but that can be just as powerful and sometimes even more effective. And while this kind of warfare isn't new, it does feel like we've entered sort of a golden age of it. And so in this conversation, I spoke with Seth Jones, director of the International Security Program at CSIS, and one of the leading experts on irregular warfare, on the different tactics and strategies of the three leading hybrid warfare powers: Iran, Russia, and China. We discuss the strengths and vulnerabilities of each country's approach, the effectiveness of their influence operations, why the US seems to lag behind in this area, or what role hybrid warfare plays in the war in Ukraine, and much more. If you want to get more geopolitical analysis to help filter the noise from the stuff that actually matters, you can sign up to my free newsletter. There, I break down big picture geopolitical stories, trends, and patterns that actually matter, and I try to provide real signal and real intelligence. You can find the link in the description. And as a reminder, the corporate sponsor of this podcast is Conductor, which provides software for crisis exercises for everything from cyber threats and supply chain security to hybrid warfare. And now, enjoy the conversation. So, welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be on. Thanks for having me.
I want to talk with you about irregular warfare and of strategies of Iran, Russia, and China in this area, which is a fascinating topic and something that you have a lot of expertise in. But I think that it probably makes sense to first define a little bit what that actually is and what we're going to be talking about, because there is a lot of terms like irregular warfare and hybrid warfare and political warfare and gray zone warfare and many other warfares and terms that are sort of flying around. And it's often quite unclear what do people mean when they use that. So how do you think about it, and what does irregular warfare actually mean in your view when you use it and when you talk about it?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one that I think it's easy to go down lots of rabbit holes, sometimes quite unproductive. It's okay to have slightly different terminology, and I'll explain in a moment. But what I think is important when talking about these terms, and again, I use irregular warfare, and partly it is the U.S. military's doctrinal term for what we'll talk about, but there are a range of others: asymmetric warfare, gray zone activity, hybrid warfare, and others that are in the sort of same area. For me, these are actions below the threshold of conventional wars and of nuclear war, for that matter. So in conventional war, certainly as described by Clausewitz, among others, in On War, you have militaries that are engaging in combat on a physical battlefield. So probably the easiest example of this is what's going on in Ukraine right now, where you have Ukrainian and Russian forces faced off against each other, and they are engaged in combat. The concerns about activity in the Taiwan Straits would be more of an air-sea battle, maybe a ground component as well, almost certainly some ground component, but a lot of other domains of warfare. Nuclear war obviously brings in the use of nuclear weapons. So when I talk about irregular warfare, I mean it in the sense of activities below the threshold of conventional war that are designed really to weaken adversaries and to strengthen oneself sort of in a comparative perspective. And they include a range of activities. They include things like offensive cyber operations. They include covert action. They include actions like information or influence operations. In a number of cases, states may use misinformation or disinformation. It may also include support to state or non-state allies and partners. So could be aiding a guerrilla organization somewhere. So think, for example, of the way the U.S. was involved in overthrowing the Taliban regime in 2001. It was a very small number of both CIA and special operations forces linking up with largely tribal or ethnic forces, so Northern Alliance and then Pashtun tribes, to overthrow the Taliban regime. So it was operating by, with, and through partner forces. So the way the U.S. aided the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in the 1980s, sort of by, with, and through partner forces. So these are all examples for me of irregular warfare. I mean, the one distinction I would make is hybrid typically, in many definitions, includes a mixture of both conventional and irregular. So elements of pitched battles as well as actions below that. And I would just say, whether one calls these whatever one calls these terms, they're really efforts to weaken adversaries and to strengthen oneself that are not pitched battles, whether they're on an ocean, in the air, or on the ground. And it's important because this is a way that major powers have for centuries fought each other kind of below the conventional threshold. So that for me is what we're largely talking about when I mean irregular warfare. And someone wants to use a different term for the same general concepts, that's fine.
I like that you've mentioned a few examples. You've mentioned the Afghanistan in the 80s, and you've mentioned that it's not a new concept. It has been sort of around since forever. But at the same time, and you write about it in the book, that in the past more or less 10 years, it seems that we're living in sort of a golden era of irregular warfare. And there has been a lot of investment into that by US adversaries, and there's been a trend of increasing use of those strategies. I wonder, when you look back, where do you, or first of all, maybe if you would agree with that, but if you do, where would you place the beginning of this trend of increasing importance of this kind of war, and how in your view it began? What were the reasons and roots of this trend?
Well, I mean, in sort of the modern era, so I'll just talk about sort of post World War II. I think one of the quintessential competitions in this space was between the Soviets and the United States, and there were also other NATO countries involved. And what became important was that when deterrence held, and it was clear that the Warsaw Pact and the Soviets were not going to invade in the Fulda Gap area, that a lot of that competition moved down to the irregular level. KGB Service A was heavily involved in a range of actions, influence campaigns, mis and disinformation, some sabotage and subversion in multiple locations. And Western countries, including the U.S., were as well. They fought each other, but never directly, working with partners and allies across Latin America. So think Guatemala or El Salvador, in Africa, and in a range of other locations. Once the Soviet Union collapsed, I think a lot of that activity, at least for the moment, was put on hold. And then when 9/11 happened, the U.S. became much more involved in campaigns against terrorist organizations, first Al-Qaeda, then the Islamic State. I think I would say sort of where we sit today, the biggest change probably happens in the late 2010s. In 2018, the Trump administration, really under H.R. McMaster, the first national security advisor for President Trump, puts together a national security strategy. And then Secretary Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, in the first Trump administration puts out a national defense strategy focusing the U.S. efforts on state-based threats, primarily the Chinese, but also the Russians and the Iranians. And I think in that context, at that period, there really starts to be a focus on countering state actors, both in the US and in Europe, against the Russians, the Iranians, and the Chinese in particular. And so for me, this sort of modern period of focusing on this type of warfare, it never stopped, but I think it received renewed attention with the shift to state-based competition. And part of the reason is, if you look at these major powers, the Chinese have nuclear weapons, the Russians have nuclear weapons. In Europe, the French and the British do, but there's this larger extended deterrence. The Americans have nuclear weapons. So conventional war among these countries is very risky. If a direct U.S.-Russian war does risk escalation up to nuclear war. I mean, it's been the big concern since the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine is escalation to nuclear war. But these kinds of irregular action, they don't risk escalation in the same way, which is why, and we can talk about this in a moment, we've seen the Russians, including the GRU, very active in Europe in this arena of irregular or hybrid warfare. So for me, it's probably within the last 10 years or so, as we've seen an uptick in state-based competition where this has become much more a focus of states.
If you're enjoying this podcast, chances are that you like to know what's going on in the world of geopolitics. And if that's the case, you might want to sign up to my newsletter. There's a lot of news on geopolitics, but most of it just doesn't actually matter. It's just chasing headlines, emotions, and breaking news. What I want to do is to try to separate all this noise and find the signal, the stuff that actually does matter and will have consequences months and years down the line. You can find the link in the description, so check it out and sign up to stay informed. I want to go through and talk about each of the three major actors that you focus on individually. But maybe before we get down to that level, if we look at them collectively, at all three of them, would you say that at a high level, there are major differences, or what are the major differences in how they approach irregular warfare, in their strategies, tactics, and their goals? And can you say that one of them is better than the other ones, or more capable in this area than the other? Is there a clear leader, or is that not the way to look at it?
Well, I think there are big differences in how, in the case of Iran, China, and Russia, how they operate and the risks that they're willing to take. If we start with the Russians, again, long history of conducting these actions. During the Cold War, it was a main focus of the KGB against the U.S. That was Service A of the KGB. More recently, it's been GRU, it's been SVR, Foreign Intelligence Agency, and then it's been some elements of the FSB, and then some other. There are a number of other Russian agencies. I would say, I would characterize the Russians as being generally pretty competent in conducting these actions. Aggressive, probably more aggressive than the Chinese in their willingness to go kinetic. So as we've seen in Europe, they have blown things up. Which warehouses, they've conducted some pretty aggressive assassinations, including against a Russian defector in Spain. We've seen the Russians conduct poisoning of individuals that have defected to the West, resided in countries like the UK. So, and then in addition, the Russians have also done something that Chinese really haven't as much of, is also leverage a range of private military companies in regions like Africa, where they have extracted resources, but done a lot of train, advise, and assist to governments, whether it's in Mali or Central African Republic, or Sudan or a number of other Libya, in addition to kind of the big battlefields like Ukraine and Syria. The Chinese, on the other hand, I think when I look at their irregular or political warfare activities, much of that has been in the influence and information spheres. Um, a number of it has been targeting universities and developing and building some, establishing some what some have called police stations to keep an eye on uh, Chinese citizens, including ones that have criticized the government. There have been arrests in New York, but there have also been a number of other similar kinds of activities across the globe. The Chinese have done a little bit recently of what I would call more sort of kinetic activity, like some cable cutting in and around Taiwan, but it's mostly information and cyber operations. PLA has always been active in offensive cyber operations, but the Chinese have generally been a lot more cautious about actually blowing things up or damaging or killing people overseas out of concern about the impact. I think the Iranians are actually different from both of those two in the sense that the Iranians, particularly the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Quds Force, which is the primary paramilitary arm that does these kinds of activities within the Iranian national security apparatus. There are others like the MOIS, Iranian intelligence, that have been active, but it's the Quds Force that has been most active. What is different about the Quds Force is just the sheer amount of allies and partners that the Iranians work through. In Lebanon, it's been Hezbollah. Syria, it's been a range of Shia and other militia forces. Iraq, it's generally been the popular mobilization forces, often Shia, but not always. Palestinian groups, including Hamas. And then in other places, Yemen, we've seen them work by, with, and through the Houthis, providing a range of different types of assistance, weapons, technology. So the Iranians have been a little bit more cautious about doing a lot on their own, sort of the way that we've seen the Russians do. They are engaged in the information sphere, but probably not as competent or as aggressively as the Chinese. But where they're really active is allies and partners, especially in the Middle East. And so I think that's how I distinguish what all of those countries are doing. And again, irregular activities really for all of them remain important, frankly, as it does for a number of Western countries as well.
I want to maybe start with Iran when individually looking at all of them in a bit more detail, because I think that it's really interesting that Iran is in a bit of a different situation than the other two, in a sense that the strategy that you've highlighted, that's based on building networks of proxy groups that Iran is allied with or controls, has in the past year or maybe 2 years sort of fell apart. And a lot of these proxies are now significantly weaker. Some, like the Assad regime in Syria, are gone entirely. And I wonder, since that was the cornerstone of Iran's irregular warfare strategy, would you say that this means that Iran's irregular warfare strategy has failed? And why do you think that happened?
Well, I'm not ready to say that Iran's strategy has failed because I don't think it's linear. I think it's certainly the case that Iran has suffered some pretty significant setbacks, certainly in the last year. Uh, the challenge, I think, is October 7th in Israel. First of all, it likely surprised everyone but Hamas, the timing. And Israeli officials have said publicly, but also privately on a couple of trips I've taken to Israel, that they're pretty confident that Hezbollah and Iran, including the Quds Force, were not given advance notice of the timing of the attacks. So this was not some sort of concerted effort across different Iranian agencies and proxy forces to target Israel. But the severe damage that Israel felt, particularly down in the Gaza envelope and in kibbutzim like Be'eri and Niroz, that lost huge chunks of the individuals in those kibbutzim, is that the Israelis then went on the offensive. And one of the areas that I think has been most striking was not wanting to be surprised again from the north. And what that meant is a range of covert and other activities against Hezbollah. I mean, what struck me is actually how effective the Israelis have been, at least in temporarily weakening Hezbollah with the walkie-talkies, the pagers, and even some laptop computers that they were able to get into the supply chain and explode. But it devastated the command and control structure, killed some very important senior leaders of Hezbollah, and then also the Israelis, in addition, supplemented these activities by striking some of the short-range ballistic missile stockpiles that Hezbollah otherwise would have used to hit back against Israel once this part of the war started. So I would just, and then obviously we talked about the Assad regime collapsing. I think in general what I'd say is that the Iranians and their proxies and partners are have seen their situation significantly weaken, probably partly because of, I think, a miscalculation by Hamas that the Israelis were able to take advantage of. Some of it's also, it's complicated to conduct these kinds of actions. I think, the Houthis are engaged in a civil war in Yemen, which has ebbed and flowed over the last several years. But what I would just caution is that this is going to be linear. I think the reality is that the future of Syria is a big question mark. And as long as the central government remains weak, which it is in many ways, certainly weak in Kurdish areas of the east of the country, there will be opportunities by the Iranians to try to rebuild networks in Lebanon, in Syria, to continue to keep them in Iraq, and then also in other areas, including Yemen. So I don't think the Iranians are down and out. They're just weakened right now, and really a big chunk of that is Israeli offensive operations.
Just a quick break here to let you know that the corporate sponsor of this podcast is Conductor, which provides software for crisis exercises for everything from cyber threats and supply chain security to hybrid warfare. Thank you, Conductor, for sponsoring this podcast. And now, back to the conversation. But you don't expect them to give up or abandon or change in some radical way the strategy that they have been pursuing so far?
No, the Iranians made a decision really after the revolution not to be a major conventional power. They did that, I think, in part because they were so reliant during the Shah's year on conventional weapons that subsided during the Iran-Iraq War, because a lot of countries were giving those weapons to the Iraqis. So instead, particularly under individuals like Qasem Soleimani, the Iranians built really their bread and butter power center in the military realm, which is irregular war. And so I don't expect them to give it up. They're going to have to make some changes. They're going to have to shore up operational security. They're going to continue, I think, to provide various types of technical means to and technologies and weapon systems to proxies and partners. I do think, there's certainly a big looming question about what the Iranians are going to do with their nuclear program. And if there's not a deal, whether we'll actually get a conventional war. The Israelis will try to go in, maybe with some help from the Americans, to take it out. So there are some risks that war could actually escalate up to the conventional level. But I think, the highest likelihood, in my view, is still the Iranians try to rebuild their proxy and partner networks.
You've mentioned Qasem Soleimani, and one of the different that I think is one of another interesting difference between Iran and Russia and China, where the architects of their respective irregular warfare strategies, and you focus on the individuals in your book as well. In case of Russia and China, they're now heading their respective militaries or are very high in the leadership. And in case of Iran, the architect of Iran's strategy is not, because he has been assassinated by the U.S. government in 2020. And I think that most people who are not following or watching Iran that closely are not really aware of how influential and how important figure he was in Iran and its national security circles. Do you see a link between his death and what has happened to Iran uh, in the past 2 years, and how their strategy has sort of unraveled? Or do you think that what has happened to their proxies would have just happened anyway, and the fact that he died did not have that much impact?
It's a hard question to answer. I mean, my general sense is that Qasem Soleimani's deputy, who is the head of the Quds Force, Ismail Khani, is a very competent actor in this irregular warfare, hybrid warfare space. He was Soleimani's deputy for years up until the assassination of 2020, and he has continued to be the critical linchpin of the Quds Force since then. I suspect the Quds Force and the Iranians would still be in this position if October 7th had happened, because I think the Israelis were going to respond pretty harshly with such a large scale set of casualties on their soil. I would say one interesting difference, though, with between Soleimani and Khani is how much Ismail Khani has decided to largely let his actions speak for themselves. The last couple of years, while Qasem Soleimani was alive, he taunted President Trump. He was very active publicly in speaking, and also had his picture taken in numerous locations in Lebanon, in Syria, and in other places. Khani, I think one lesson he has taken away is not to be publicly blusterous, not to brag, not to publicly insult, certainly along those lines, but to largely let actions speak louder than words. And what it probably means is that, he's gone under the radar screen for most people. Um, I, I, I don't think, again, that the challenges Iran has had probably have had as much to do with the change in leadership from Soleimani, and more that the Israelis have responded pretty proactively once October 7th happened. They certainly didn't before then, and were pretty effective. I think probably would have been in many ways, even if Soleimani had been around.
So, moving from Iran to Russia as the next actor, I would say that Russia is probably almost synonymous out of the three with irregular warfare and hybrid warfare, however you want to call it. And it's for a number of reasons, it's very famous for it, has received by far the most attention for it, and we do see it as very competent at it. Would you, or how effective would you actually consider Russia to be in this area? And do you think that it is as effective as we generally tend to see it?
I think there is an interesting difference between effectiveness, meaning achieving specific results, and active. The Russians are definitely active. By our analysis, for example, the number of Russian attacks in the U.S., we would term these irregular warfare. Actually, the terminology Russia has generally used are active measures. A number of attacks in Europe tripled between 2023 and 2024. And they had quadrupled between 2022 and 2023. The primary targets of Russian attacks included transportation targets, government, critical infrastructure like pipelines and fiber optic undersea cables, industry targets. They've bombed and conducted bombings against defense companies that have provided weapons or other material to Ukraine. We've seen recently the prosecution of individuals involved in the IKEA attacks in Lithuania. And those Russian attacks have included explosives. They've used blunt or edged instruments. These are, for example, Russia's shadow fleet of cargo vessels that have cut fiber optic cables, or in some cases, potentially pipelines, and then various types of electronic attack. So, they're active, very active, in fact, and I'm not even including a lot of their private military company activity elsewhere. Part of that's also been assassinations. But I think, it's an interesting question about how effective they have been. I think if one is talking about changing the behavior of the U.S. or European states during this activity, probably not. I mean, hard to know why. The main actor is the GRU, the main intelligence directorate. Probably have not changed behavior, but it is interesting to note whether that was really their objective in the first place. I think certainly it's influencing governments to think twice about escalating aid to Ukraine. Have they done that? Maybe in some cases, but probably not in all. Hard to see that the British government, for example, has significantly changed its behavior because of some of these attacks. So I'm not sure that that if I were to grade the Russians in effectiveness, I don't think I'd give them an A, maybe like a B minus or C plus.
You said that maybe the effectiveness was not the goal, or the changing of the behavior was not the goal of this ongoing campaign. If that wasn't the goal, what would be the goal? Thank you for listening to this conversation. If you'd like to hear the rest of it, you can find it on my Patreon. Click the link in the description or go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics. And if you decide to become a supporter, you get bonus content, Patreon-only episodes, and you will be able to ask questions to my future guests.